Welcome to this episode of a Creative Approach podcast. I'm your host, Karen Poirier-Brody. My guest today is Vidya Viswanathan. Vidya is a student physician at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and is the founder of the website Doctors Who Create, a page that fosters a community to change the culture of medicine and that rewards and encourages creativity. I enjoy meeting colleagues in medicine who have an interest in creativity, and am anxious to hear today from Vidya. I hope you found something to commemorate on May 5th weekend. I mentioned Scrapbook Day in the last podcast, and I'm happy to report it was an excellent weekend of celebrating creativity for me. It's always enjoyable to be around other people who spark one's own creativity. I made a decorated traveler's notebook and produced 5 pages since last week, and have even started a few more. I concentrated more on the design of the page since I've not done much paper scrapbooking recently. Now I'm interested in exploring the more detailed storytelling on some pages. Another creative passion I plan to explore is printmaking. I've signed up for an art class this summer with one of my favorite instructors at Sacramento City College, Emily Wilson. I've dabbled a bit in the making of prints before, and I'm hoping to improve my skills in the art with an intensive 6-week course. It ends just before I head to Podcast Movement in Philadelphia this summer. Lots more learning and inspiration ahead. I'm especially delighted as I look forward to a podcast learning session with the hosts Jess and Elsie from She Podcast Show shortly before the convention starts. I do have a passion for lifelong learning. Today I explored doing a manicure with press-on nails. It sounds like something I should have done as a teen, but makeup and personal adornment, for a number of reasons, is only something I've explored in the past few years. Whether frivolous or thoughtful, we are serious about creativity here, but always open for entertainment. Let's engage now in a conversation with student physician Vidya Viswanathan as she discusses her award-winning creative approach. Good morning and welcome to a Creative Approach podcast. And I'm so glad to have with me Vidya Viswanathan, my guest today, who is a physician who is involved in a website called Doctors Who Create. And I met Vidya when I presented her with the Artist in Residence Award at the most recent American Medical Women's Association. And a non-disclaimer here in that I was not involved in the committee that picked Vidya as the recipient of this award. I was just honored to be the physician co-chair of that committee, and had the opportunity to award that to her. And then I thought, she's done some amazing things here, and I am going to ask her to be on the show today. So welcome, Vidya.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me for this show. I'm really excited to talk about creativity.
Yes, and we're so delighted to have you. And I think probably what we should, you do have this website, and I think I usually start off with asking about just what it is you do so people have an idea of your life and what it is you're doing creatively. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how your website started and what's involved in the site?
Yeah, so I'm a physician in training, so I'm a medical student rising 4th year at the University of Pennsylvania. But I came to medicine through a more roundabout path. So in undergrad, I had focused my studies on social science, and I had actually really focused on Chinese history and studying the language of Mandarin Chinese. Spent a lot of time in China, and I never thought that I would be interested in medicine. I actually was very interested in writing and thought about becoming a journalist. But I also liked working with people and specifically with kids, so I had thought about becoming a teacher. So those are kind of the 2 front-running professions in my mind. But then when I was in Taiwan, I lived in Taiwan for a year after college, while I was there, I just started getting really interested in healthcare and in the stories that come up through the experience people have in medicine. And I read a lot of physician authored books. And that's when I started thinking like medicine is a really amazing confluence of different things I like talking to people, knowing their stories, helping them, and also, writing about it, whether for my colleagues or for a broader audience. So that's kind of how I then did a post-bac, and during the post-bac was freelance writing and was kind of combining my interest in science and the humanities in that way. But the reason I had the idea to start my website, Doctors Who Create, was because before I started becoming a pre-med or becoming interested in medicine, I always felt that people encouraged me to be creative no matter what, and that creativity was really a prized attribute to have in other professions. So when I was considering journalism or teaching, or even talking to my friends who ended up going to business school or law school, as much as there was an importance on their academic record and value placed on their grades, I think a lot of them were able to pursue creative things as part of their career path. While when I became pre-med, I felt like all of the things that made me unique, like my writing and like other interests, people advised me, you should be refocusing your time on studying for the MCAT, on making sure you get good grades, doing some sort of research and trying to get published. And even though I don't think those activities are inherently bad, I just didn't feel like it didn't fit what I brought to medicine. And so I really struggled with like this almost loss of identity and feeling like people and this profession I had chosen was trying to put me in a box. But then I did meet a lot of physicians who are later in their career who have been able to be creative and use that to influence the medical profession in a really positive way and to prevent themselves from burning out. And so I started Doctors Who Create to profile those physicians and tell their story and kind of use them as an example for people like me, of how I could keep creativity part of my career. So I started that in 2015. So it was the year I had just found out I had gotten accepted into med school. And so it felt a little bit like less of a risk to start it because I wasn't like being evaluated at that point. I'd already accepted coming to Penn. And so I spent that summer before med school really starting this website at doctorswhocreate.com. And I interviewed a bunch of physicians who I looked up to and put their interviews up on the site. And then I also wrote a bunch of blog posts. And it was really just me in the beginning. But then more and more people started reading it and asking how they could contribute. So after about a year of operation, I got other med students and residents and physicians involved in writing and editing for the site. And now also with social media, and we're trying to start a podcast and maybe even plan a conference. So we have a lot of people on board trying to promote creativity in medicine through the organization. And so that's kind of the story of why I made it in the first place.
That's wonderful. And of course, I am all for that, because being a physician who has a podcast on creativity, and not just in medicine, but generally, I'm all for that. And a couple of things you hit on. One thing, eons and eons ago, when I was starting medical school, we were told on our first day that we were physicians. We were just physicians in training. And so don't say I'm not a doctor, and never use the word just a medical student, because you are a physician in training. Once you make that commitment, I think that's a really big thing. And it sure woke me up that day in class to, hey, this is how I have to look at myself from now on. And it is a calling. And I think it's kind of, keeping that in perspective, that you may be in training, maybe you can't, write prescriptions yet without somebody signing off on things and whatever, but you're still doing this important work. And patients certainly see the people who come to them that are asking their history, which is part of a story. I wanted to get to that too, is so much of medicine is involved in storytelling and helping us find the answers that way. So you do bring a rather valuable and unique, and even though you have a unique perspective there, but you bring a valuable gift to medicine. So don't ever take that down. And I'm glad you can see beyond the box, because it isn't all, it's nice to have academic physicians who concentrate on the science of everything. But the fact is, a lot of us won't find out about how to help people without their stories.
Yeah. It's so true. And you're really right. As a medical student, I think we often, in our clerkship year, I often found that I was able to spend a lot more time with patients than other members of my team who had more responsibilities. And so it was amazing because the patients really connected with me and saw me as part of the team. And you're right that when you introduce yourself as student doctor to the patient, every person who comes in the room is important to them. And so you do feel like a lot of responsibility in patient care.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it is, and that's another key point. I think the teamwork that's involved is really key in medicine. And I hope that patients, if the listener is a patient, not a physician, that they understand that, this whole thing can't be done without the whole team being involved in their care. And now, when you set out to do this and set up your blog, you said you were just looking around for people who might be role models. And how did you decide exactly what direction you were going to take the blog? So
I knew that I definitely wanted to reach out to people who would be not just role models for me, as I think my creative focus is mostly writing, but also for people who were physicians balancing their careers with artwork or entrepreneurship or, advocacy. And I just wanted to reach out to physicians who were doing interesting things that I didn't even necessarily know much about, so that other med students in those fields would be able to learn something from those profiles. So I just did a lot of reading about what people were doing. And I think joining Twitter was a huge part of discovering the interesting work physicians are doing around the world. But then I really wanted the blog section because I think the question and answer format is helpful, but I wanted there to also be a more first person narrative format where people could submit posts that were just their own thoughts on creativity in medicine or on patient encounters. So that's why we have a daily dose section, which is the blog, and then the profiles and creativity section. And then now we actually have 2 new sections. There's a book review section that we just started this year. And we also have a visual arts section where people can submit photos of visual artwork they've done, and we can showcase that. And then 2 sections that I'm hoping to grow more are the events and opportunity sections, which I'm hoping that the organization and its website can be a hub for all the things that are going on to sort of be publicized. Because I think one problem I've noticed is there are a lot of med students and physicians who are interested in meeting other creative people and finding connections for their creative work. But if you're spread out around the country or even around the world, it's hard to know what's even going on in the city that you work in. And so trying to post events and opportunities so that there's somewhere central that people can find that is part of what we're aiming to do. So that's how I created these series of sections. But we also realized, me and the rest of the team realized, that we have so much great audio content from doing these profiles. And so that's why part of our goal is to maybe create a podcast with the existing audio content that we have. And I think right now most of what we've done has been online. But like I'd mentioned in the beginning, I think part of the mission is to create this online culture, but also bring it to real life, have a conference. We're even thinking of having some sort of writing contest where we send out a prompt and have people respond to it. And that way it really gets people more engaged with their own thoughts about how creativity has influenced their medical career.
And it isn't, of course, your blog is open to the public at large, and most people listening to my podcast are not going to be physicians. So
Yeah.
I think sort of what would you sum up as the broader appeal to the listener who's listening to this podcast right now?
Yeah, I think the broader appeal would be just that, like, showing a different side of physicians, because I know that, most people end up interacting with the medical system, and there's a large portion of people who really interact quite frequently with the medical system, and many patients write about the experiences they've had and sometimes negative experiences they've had. And so I think the website also humanizes the medical profession by showing some of physicians' innermost feelings about the work they do. And I think it's helpful to the broader public to see that side of physicians in general. But also, I think it would be really interesting to have patients write even more about what they experience. In the age of social media, I think we've been seeing more and more patient stories, but I think encouraging patients to have creative outlets is a huge part of the mission of creating a medical culture that fosters creativity, because I think there has been research done that art and reflective writing has improved patients' quality of life. And if we could, as a medical profession, see that as more valuable, then it would help patients as well. So hopefully any general person reading the website would find the stories interesting and this aspect of the medical profession interesting. And then my personal hope, once I became a pre-med, I was thinking, the pre-med path was always presented to me from the academic standpoint in high school or in college as very narrow. But if I had seen a site like this when I was like a high school student or a college student, I might have thought about medical profession earlier. So I think I'm hoping that it'll bring more creative people into medicine, because I think there are a lot of things about the application process for med school and residency and the things we value in that process that could change. And so I'm hoping that if we can help change that and we can bring more creative people into the profession, it would become a better environment for everyone.
Very good points. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as coming into medicine earlier, I'm not so sure, because I would think that having Chinese as a background of studies has got to be incredibly valuable, and you bring something else to the profession by having your experiences. There aren't, it's certainly the most people in the world speak Chinese, right? As far as the language.
No. Oh, no, I know. Have loved learning Chinese, and actually that's one of my goals is after residency applications is to go back to China or Taiwan or do some sort of language learning now that I can also be useful in the medical setting, because I think one of the sad things about med school is not really having the time to hone my language skills further.
Right. And being able to live in an environment and do something medical, but being in an environment where people are speaking the language you're interested in is always going to improve that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, I think maybe we should get back more to the beginning to see where your journey started and what sort of brought you to where you are today, because it didn't just start off studying Chinese. I mean, could you give us a little bit of a background about where you were born, and maybe did your parents have any influence on some of these paths you were taking? Or
Yeah. So I was born in Long Island, New York, and my parents are both immigrants from India. So they moved here in the 80s, and they're both actually physicians. So my dad is a psychiatrist in Brooklyn, and my mom is a pediatric hematologist oncologist. And it's really interesting. I think, so they went through medical training in India, and they came here and did residency here and have practiced here their whole life. And I think a lot of people assume that as an Indian American with physician parents, that they push me to do medicine. It's more that I have two older brothers, and they really pushed all three of us to just work hard at whatever it is we wanted, but they would never dissuade me from pursuing any interest I had. And from a young age, I really loved writing. And so I was always like reading and writing stories. And I was like that kid always reading at the dinner table, like under the table in class, even in elementary school. And like we didn't play outside that much because I was always reading. And my mom actually, she was the person who like gave me all my favorite books. Like she loves to read, and I think like every evening before bed, I would see her reading. I think that's a huge part of modeling creativity, is just like seeing someone balance their creative interests with their career. And, you know, she was busy as a hem-onc doctor, but she was always reading and then giving me books that she thought I would like. And then I would read them and we could talk about them. And I would always pretend to be like, oh, I don't want to read the book you recommended. But then I would end up reading it and then be like, hey, can we get the second book in that series? You know? So
you sound a lot like one of my sons who would, I mean, I practically had to pull teeth to make him read books. And then I would hear him laughing his head off or actually crying from laughing so hard from reading like Anne of Green Gables. Like, you know, that was sort of some sissy book or something he didn't want to read. And he would come out and say, oh, that's the best book I've ever read, Mom.
It's got to be a gratifying feeling. I think my mom I think it really peaked for her when she, very early on, I think part of it is being a pediatrician. She would hear a lot about books that were supposed to be good, and she would read them and then like be like, do you want to read this? And so she had heard very early on about Harry Potter, and like before it was that popular in America, and she got it from the library and gave it to me, and I was like, I don't know what this is. And then I read it and I was like, this was so good. And you know, then it took off like everywhere, and I was like, wow, she's really an early adopter. But so I had been writing a lot, and my parents always encouraged my writing and anything. But I think because I really loved everything, and I always had this bent towards social service and social justice. And in high school, I was volunteering at a soup kitchen, and I was just really passionate about solving social issues. And I've always been very idealistic. And I think they felt that I would enjoy a career in medicine from that standpoint. And so they always suggested it. And I did love science. Like in high school, I took advanced physics classes and chemistry because I actually enjoyed it a lot. So they'd said, like, if you consider medicine, like it has all these aspects in the career that you would enjoy, but they didn't really push me towards it because they just wanted me to pursue whatever it is I found most compelling. And of course, I couldn't decide any one thing because I liked everything. And I knew I would always continue writing. I think since like elementary school, I had been continually writing. And then in high school, I really got into journalism specifically with our high school newspaper. So I think back then medicine just seemed too limited, but not because of their stories or their profession, because hearing the stories from my dad in psychiatry and my mom with the kids she worked with, they were really compelling and interesting. But I think the path to get there didn't seem very creative. So I decided to just sort of just follow my interests. And I would say my interest in Chinese came from my public high school ended up having about a population of 50% Asians, and that included Indian, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Japanese. But I did have a lot of classmates who spoke Mandarin Chinese, and when I would meet their parents, they would be speaking in Mandarin, and I just thought it's such a interesting, different language. I loved the culture, and when I started college, I went to Harvard, and it was amazing because there were all these languages you could take, and I thought, you know, Chinese is so useful. It's spoken by so many people, as you said, and it would be amazing to learn this new script, which is almost like a new art form to me. Like Chinese calligraphy is just so beautiful and so different, and I really wanted to understand it. And I thought, if I'm formally taking a language as a college course, like Chinese is the one that you should formally take because you can't pick it up just by living there and expect to learn it. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of memorization and practice and immersion. So I thought, this is a good language to take. I think
That's very
yeah.
challenging. I have tried to learn Chinese and I just can't get those sounds on the vowels very good.
I know the sounds. Well, so kind of like related to creativity, one thing I thought about a lot when I took Chinese and then actually became better at it when I went to China. So the first summer of college, I spent the summer in this intensive language learning course in Beijing. And it was also the summer of the Beijing Olympics, like 2008. So it was really fascinating being there because everyone was expecting there to be a lot of foreigners there for the Olympics. And so everyone was just almost like very social and chatty. Like if they saw you, they would ask if you were there for the Olympics. And like you would just end up having a lot of random conversations with people. And so like knowing Chinese and being able to have that conversation in Chinese was really rewarding. But yeah, and the other thing I realized was that you could have a whole different personality in Chinese because of the tones and like the way you were speaking. I found that it made me almost feel a little like almost like a different person. And I thought it was really eye-opening. And it has also made me reflect a lot on how patients feel here when, English is a second language and they're trying to express their pain in English, but, how much better would it be as a physician if you could speak someone's primary language and actually know their real expression of what they're trying to say. So
Now, that almost made me laugh because what I think is that sometimes we're speaking a medical language that is totally foreign to patients. It might be useful to also speak
yeah,
English.
yeah. So true.
But that's my perspective on that one, is that I think sometimes we forget that patients don't understand the mumbo jumbo of our
Sure.
language and speaking more plainly even in English. But of course, being able to speak, English or Spanish or French. I mean, I have a smattering of French and I've tried picking up some Spanish. And it is helpful though, because I understand a lot more than I speak. So it really helps a lot.
Yeah, I always wish I spoke Spanish. So
Well,
actually,
you have lots of time to learn.
totally. I mean, I do. My parents, they're from South India, specifically from this region called Tamil Nadu, and the language is called Tamil. And I only understand it. I can't speak it, and it's really frustrating because I can understand a lot, but then if I try to communicate, I can't think of the words. And now that I know Chinese fairly well, I can only think of Chinese words. I studied French in high school and was pretty good at French in high school, but now if I try to speak French, I also can only think of Chinese. So I have this worry that if I try to learn Spanish, then maybe I'll lose Chinese, but I still want to learn it because it's so useful. But I do think language learning is a huge part of creativity. Like I love drawing connections between like linguistic connections between different languages and thinking about how like in Chinese there might be multiple words or characters for something that we only have one word for, or just like I love that in Chinese the characters can sometimes be a picture of the word they're trying to convey. So you like have this very visual aspect to learning the language that you don't have in English. And so I definitely feel like it made me more creative to both learn the language and then be exposed to China as a different country and see different culture firsthand, and then also compare it with my like family's visits to India. And like that cross-cultural experience definitely has helped me be more creative and see things from a different perspective.
For sure. That's one thing. I am a strong advocate of travel, of broadening our mind and bringing more experience. And how was China? I mean, for most of us, I mean, we may hear a little bit about India, maybe because we're hearing more about Bollywood than anything, which is not necessarily, but we have some idea. But I think China seems so terribly different because not many people have the experience of going there. So what was that like?
I think it was an amazing experience each time I went. So I went for 3 summers in college. So I was the first summer the language program in Beijing. Then the next summer I was working for a newspaper in Hong Kong. And then the third summer working for a newspaper in Shanghai and doing some thesis research. And then the year after college I was in Taiwan for like teaching English in an elementary school. And I would say each time I went, it was very different, which I think because I was in different cities doing different things. And I think that helped because one of the problems I see with sometimes news coverage or the way people conceive of China is this very monolithic place, but it's amazingly diverse where, from city to city or county to county. And it's also interesting because there's so many people and you do feel the population, like when you are taking the subway, for example, in Shanghai, it's really overwhelming. And I think it gave me a lot of insight into how it must feel to grow up among such a high population. But then on the opposite spectrum, I felt that people were very welcoming of me when we had some sort of connection. So for example, when I worked in Shanghai, my coworkers were just incredibly welcoming and, helped me with whatever I needed, whether it was finding my apartment or helping me purchase things. Like they just went out of their way to help me. And when I lived in Taiwan, I had a co-teacher who was like teaching English at the school where I worked. And so I was sort of like her co-teacher for the classes, and we also ran a after-school English club. And she basically, like, I would call her like my sister, like my older sister, because she really just made me feel at home in Taiwan and went out of her way to help me. And so I think what I felt was that in many ways the culture and the environment is very different, but people are really open to meeting Americans and learning about our experiences in a way where I feel sometimes embarrassed about how in America sometimes like people when they speak English that's accented or if they're difficult to understand, I don't think there's as much patience for that. But there, if I was like stumbling through Chinese, people would be very patient and encouraging. And I actually wrote an article about it for my undergrad paper, just about that difference in how much better I felt there. There are also other interesting parts, like I'm a vegetarian, so being specifically in China was very difficult at times. I really had to push to make sure I got vegetarian food. But then, you discover, so for example, a lot of Buddhist communities there, they have vegetarian food at the temples, or they have like all vegetarian buffet restaurants. You can find those. And then even in regular restaurants, as my Chinese got better, I was able to kind of anticipate what dishes would have meat, even if they said, oh, there's no meat, when I asked. Right. And I would be able to specifically say, like, please don't put this fish sauce in this dish, and so like I became better, and then I ended up loving the food there. And politically, it's just very interesting and different to talking to people about their political experiences there. It's kind of something that people don't really like talking about in mainland China, but in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, I had a lot of interesting discussions about the political situation. And then it also enabled me to talk to people studying in the US who are from mainland China about their like kind of political feelings about the country. And so overall, I just feel like I've learned so much, but there's still so much to learn. It's just such a huge country. And I find that like I could go, even if I went back frequently, I would still not even get past the surface of like all the different cultures and languages and things there are to do there.
It sounds fascinating. I think, China is a place that I would like to visit someday, as would be India. I mean, of course,
Yeah,
there you have family to facilitate your visit
exactly.
and
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
kind of, you don't really run into having to, how do I figure this out so much?
Yeah.
Because there's so much help probably
Yeah.
when you go there. But it is different. I mean, I don't know how, did you go from a very young age to India? Did your parents take you when you were a small child, or
Yeah.
were you somewhat like a school age when they decided to take such a long trip? Or
Yeah, I went when I was young. Like I definitely went when I was around 1 or 2 years old, and then like every few years after that we would go because both my parents still have family there.
family, yeah.
So yeah, so we would go and visit and then start like, for high school and college with my schedule, my brother's schedules being a little bit less aligned sometimes like we wouldn't go as frequently. But then so I just got married last year and my husband and I got together in 2013. So since then I've been going frequently with him because his family is actually in New Delhi. So now I get to go every year, and it's really amazing because I do feel like it's India has changed a lot since when I first went when I was young to now, and they're actually relating back to my website, Doctors Who Create. I've been getting a lot of emails from med students and physicians in India who find the website really interesting and encouraging, and I think that the problems with, over reliance on standardized tests and a medical culture being lacking in empathy, they face the same problems there, perhaps to a greater extent with the very test-driven system, especially with the high population. And so I'm like actually really curious about speaking more to physicians there about their experience in medical training.
Awesome. Well, and you also now you have a bigger perspective of India too, and that you have to go to more than one place.
Yeah, exactly.
And that too is a diverse, it's not a uniform sort of country. It's very
Yeah.
diverse too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my husband, Nihit, his family speaks Hindi, so that's
Yeah.
another language I'm on my list.
Right. Well, but languages open new ideas too because of things that are written in different languages and as you
Yeah,
said, different way. For example, the fact that there are so many words for one idea in one culture, but maybe not in another. So, that whole idea of the origins of the language and what kind of patterns of behavior and food and environment created the language kind of
yeah,
mold people in a way too. That's something that carries on with us, not just our genes carrying from one generation to another, but also what formed the country and formed the people is
hmm,
often manifest in the language, not just in the stories we tell. But the
yeah,
stories we tell are the really important parts and are fun to discover. And
yeah,
I'm glad that you're getting those down and that people have an opportunity. And again, that's www.doctorswhocreate.com, right?
yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh. And what I thought, your past been interesting, the website's interesting, and you've mentioned a little bit about creativity in general, but we kind of end the show with the guests' thoughts on creativity in general. And I was wondering if you had any reflections on that for us today.
Yeah, I think creativity in general is like requires a lot of faith in just the process of what you do. So for me, if I focus too much on, say, the product of my writing, like, is it going to be good? Am I going to be able to finish this? Where will I be able to publish it somewhere? Then I find that my creative energy sort of gets used up or, it's wasted and I lose it because I can't focus on the process. I'm instead focusing on the result. But I think the process of writing for me, for example, is it's not always easy, of course, like sometimes the writing flows, sometimes it doesn't, but just committing myself to the idea that, I always enjoy the like process of writing once I get into that flow, and that it's worth it to do it. And that even if no one read my writing, even if I chose not to share it with anyone, it's actually valuable to me as an activity. When I remember that, that's when I can actually, I exercise my creativity. And then the other thing is I try not to think of things as we say in medicine, as high yield. So I think in medical training, a lot of information or things that are presented to us are classified as you should do this or learn this because it's high yield, meaning like it will definitely bring you something beneficial. But to me, in the creative process, you have to be willing to waste time on things, not know where things are going. Like some of the things I've done have been random in a way, like learning Chinese. It was a little bit on a whim, and then I ended up deep diving into that and learning a lot about China as a result. Or even in medicine, like in medical school, I've participated in a bunch of story slams and started this website. And it always starts as more of a random thought that maybe I'll pursue this because it seems interesting, and not as like something that like this is very high yield, it will definitely bring me some sort of reward, or it will definitely be successful. Like I think if you focus too much on results, then you don't actually get to enjoy the creative process. So my kind of advice to myself has always been to remember that you don't need to know where something is going to work on it. That's kind of what it means to be creative, is that you just are following what you're interested in and just seeing where it goes.
Yeah, the creative journey is very important.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I have really enjoyed getting to know you better, and you are definitely well-deserved of the current artist in residence of the American Medical Women's Association. And I've loved your stories today, and we'll look forward to learning more on your website and encourage you in all your endeavors in medicine and in writing and in traveling. And I know the listeners enjoyed listening to this conversation as well. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be on this podcast.
Okay. Well, we'll be talking to you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Show notes from today's episode of A Creative Approach podcast, where you can learn more about Vidya, are available on the webpage www.acreativeapproachpodcast.com. Please join our Creative Approach Facebook page and the A Creative Approach Facebook group page too. There, we welcome your questions and feedback on the show. Our affiliate links can be found at a Creative Approach podcast website. I hope you're a subscriber to a Creative Approach podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again for listening. Please join in future conversations where I hope you will find inspiration to make things, tell your story, and explore a creative approach to life.